Welcome, everyone. I've got lots of information. I'm going to try and get through it as quickly as possible and provide an opportunity for you to ask questions at the end. So I'll start and welcome your feedback at the end. So are you getting excited about the municipal election? Well, obviously the neighbor's not. What municipal election? So as elected officials, mayors and council, you have a huge job. You took on the challenge for the betterment of your community. You get very little remuneration. You get lots of volunteer hours, lots of committee work, and unfortunately, lots of criticism. Very little recognition and remuneration, but you want to do it for the right reasons, for the betterment of your community. And what's really disappointing is we have so many people that don't get involved in the municipal election process, and we have very low turnout. So hopefully we see greater turnout. Once you're elected, you have great expectations, and I apologize for the American cartoon here. I couldn't find a Canadian one. You got great expectations that you're going to change things. And then unfortunately, you get down to the facts and you find out you've got a bare bones budget with very limited resources. And I understand Premier Wall told you yesterday that you're not in line for huge increases. And then you find out that a big percentage of those resources are for fixed costs, and quite often, wages and benefits for employees. And then you get to deal with the chronic moaners, complainers, and whiners who criticize you. You have to constantly listen to them, and unfortunately, they don't take the time to vote. And then, of course, you've got government at work. Poor municipal employees, they get the bad rap all the time of leaning on shovels. And we all know most of them are very hard, dedicated workers. But again, they take a big chunk of your budget. And so as council, sometimes you tend to get too involved with the municipal employer side of it rather than your governance side of it. So today, what we're going to do is we're going to cover council's role as an employer. We're going to endeavor to emphasize the governance roles and responsibilities versus operational roles and responsibilities. We're going to briefly review the legislation, what's the elected officials' roles and responsibilities, what's administrators' roles and responsibilities, and discuss the blur that sometimes is created when there's lack of clarity in terms of what those duties and responsibilities are, and talk a bit about the liabilities, because as employees, there's an onus of responsibility, and as employers, there's also an onus of responsibility, but there can be huge liabilities incurred if you're not maintaining your respective roles. Then we're going to briefly touch on best tools and practices to maintain that clarity and governance. Then we're going to discuss performance management. How many of you do performance evaluations? Awesome, great, good to see. That's a critical first step. And then we're going to talk about what to do when things aren't going well, the principle of progressive discipline. We're going to briefly touch on the duty to accommodate is a legislative requirement, and again, it's a huge liability if you don't handle it properly. And lastly, we're going to talk about employment contracts, the importance of them, and what to have in them. So before you, you see the municipal governance fundamentals. We have the public sets the expectations. They elect the council. Council shows the leadership. They get reelected. And some of you have been probably elected for many, many terms. Your role is a governance role. You set bylaws, policies, and service levels. You have an employer-employee relationship, ideally with one person. That's your CAO administrator. The CAO administrator is then responsible for the administration, the operational segment of the budget, and ensuring that services are delivered to meet the expectations of the general public. So a quick legislative review. First and foremost, every council must establish the position of administrator, and it must be a qualified administrator. In the Cities Act, the same thing applies. So with the exception of a city solicitor and a clerk, that is the one and only position that you as a council are responsible for recruiting and appointing. That's it, that's all. How many of you are operating under that framework? Okay. I mean, ideally, that's where you want to go. You know, your CAO, your administrator, that is the individual that should be dealing with any employment issues directly with those employees. So the role of the elected official is directly, one-on-one, responsible for your administrator, your CAO. You have the employer-employee relationship. You're responsible for their supervision, their performance evaluation, setting their rates of pay, and determining a succession plan. But again, that's as far as the legislation goes. Council then is indirectly responsible for the rest of the employees, and you do that by setting policies, bylaws, resolutions, and you do not determine the day-to-day management of those employees, but you set the policies that indirectly affect them. An example would be determining the general wage increase for 2016, setting the salary schedule for 2016. That's your role as a council, but it's not your role as a council to determine which grader operator or which municipal employee should be receiving what wage. That should be upon the recommendation of your CAO. You must trust and have confidence in your public works crew, in your CAO, to bring forward those recommendations. Council determines the level of services and programs, and it's administration who determines those levels of service and programs. So if you're worrying about snow removal, there should be some criteria for service. For example, emergency routes, high traffic routes, schools, those kind of things, those should be the areas cleared first for snow removal. But you as an individual council member should not have the right or authority, you don't technically, based on the legislation, to tell the operator where to go and remove the snow. So your administrator is your main policy advisor to council. They are the experts. They're trained. It's their responsibility to ensure that they're informing you of your legislative requirements. They manage the day-to-day operations. They carry out the duties and directions of council. They oversee the budget. Council establishes the budget. Their role is to oversee it and ensure that there's no deficit budgeting. They, the administrator, are the spokesperson for the rest of the employees. They are responsible for the direct supervision of all of the other employees. It is not a council responsibility. They're responsible for all reports to council. And then the legislation goes on in detail as to what the duties of the administrator are. Safekeeping of documents, the minutes, recording who's at the meeting, corporate seal, record retention, statements sent to the minister, official correspondence of the council, the bylaw register, the monthly reports, payables, the expenditures and annual financial statements. So the legislation clearly identifies what your CAO administrator must do, and then council can determine what else they should be doing. And how do you do that? Well, ideally in a contract of employment, job description, and those types of documents, policies and procedures, identify what that scope of duty and responsibility is for your CAO. Then your CAO, subject to the approval of council, may delegate some of their powers to other employees. And again, if it's clearly defined in the job description in your policies and procedures, that is a great operational method to ensure that the work is being done and to ensure that there's clarity and accountability for the work. So again, in the Cities Act, the commissioner may delegate any or all of her powers. So they don't require council approval. And under the Municipalities Act, council approval is required before any duties are delegated. So that's how you manage what is happening in your municipality. So ideally, there should be 100% clarity for every employee. All employees should know what they're expected to do, not if I can hold it for a while. We're just going to review quickly Section 92 of the Municipalities Act. And as you'll note, I've highlighted two areas. They are, in B, to participate in developing and evaluating policy, services, and programs of the municipality. And in D, to ensure that administrative practices and procedures are in place to implement the decisions of council. So you develop, evaluate policies, but you don't manage and monitor them on a day-to-day basis. You evaluate them, you monitor them from a council role, but it's not your job to administrate those policies. That's the role of your CAO as well as your employees. Then there's other duties that you cannot delegate. I'm sure you're all aware of them, but you can't delegate someone else to have a public hearing. You, as a council, must adopt the budget. You must ensure there's a record retention schedule. You determine which properties are exempt from taxation. It's only council that can move capital into operating, and it's only council that can develop a purchasing policy. And that's a critical piece in terms of managing your financial resources, is having a purchasing policy. And I'm sure you're aware there are many municipalities that have them, and if you don't have one, plagiarize from another municipality. Take a look at what they're doing so that you're not kind of into your elbows and knees in terms of dealing with the day-to-day operations. The sale and lease of property. And if you note in Q, it is the power of council to appoint, suspend, or dismiss an administrator. So that's it. That's the only person you hire. That's the only person you fire. That's the scope of the legislation relative to putting the onus and responsibility on council. There's no one else. Then the duties of the mayor. Quite often in municipalities, the expectation is the mayor is taking care of all the personnel issues. Well, the mayor presides at your meetings. The mayor is your convener and is on all your committees. But see the duties of the legislation. There's nothing in there that says the mayor has the responsibility to oversee the CAO or any of the employees. Okay? In order to suspend, terminate an administrator, you must have a majority decision of council. The mayor cannot terminate a member. It's only a majority decision of the council. And if you notice on B, termination can be for just cause, or in B, on reasonable notice of compensation in lieu of reasonable notice, or pursuant to the terms of an employment contract. How many of you have employment contracts? Just a quick show. Excellent, okay? Many of you don't. That's a huge liability, especially if you have a long-term employee. It is highly recommended that you do have employment contracts with all your employees, and we will touch on that briefly. So the general role of council is a governance and leadership role, not a managing role. You're not an employee. Your role is to appoint, suspend, and dismiss an manager, administrator, a one-on-one employer-employee relationship. That's as far as it goes. To participate in developing and evaluating the policy, services, and programs. Ensure the administrative practices and procedures are in place to implement the decisions of council. Now, quite often when I'm speaking to councillors, they say, well, I need to know what's going on because I'm responsible for the financial integrity of the municipality. And if I don't see everything, how am I going to know what's going on? Well, as we covered before, you have the right to establish procurement or purchasing policies that set limits for your administration. Might be 500, might be 5,000. But you have the right to set up a standard, a practice, a procedure that allows the guys to go get an oil filter, but specifies what that spending limit is and what comes to you for approval. When you set your budget, you set your overall budget. Your administration cannot deficit budget. So if there's anything that is out of line, they're to come to you and report. Okay? And then you also have the ability to hire your auditors that come in and do an audit. So quite often, purchasing policies will alleviate you of that constant scrutinization with respect to the financials, what is being paid. So the legislation in the Municipalities Act 1112 goes on to state no member of council is eligible to be appointed as an employee. You're not an employee. So an employee manages and supervises. You're not employees. You're the governance role model leader. The legislation goes on to say that any decision of council must be held in an open meeting, and you require a duly constituted meeting and a resolution passed by the majority of council. Again, emphasizing that you as individual members of council are not employees and do not have the right to direct the employees unless you do so through a resolution of council, or establish a policy or procedure or bylaw that regulates how the work is performed by your employees. If there's a tied vote, the motion's defeated. So just want to emphasize again, individual members of council, unless there's a policy or resolution, do not have the authority to direct any employee of the municipality. So having said that, what do you do when you come across a work site like this? Anybody with any suggestions? It's difficult. Record it. Bang on. Document it. Date, time, place, what you see. Now, you take a look at it, you see a whole bunch of people leaning on shovels, but if you walk up to that site, if you don't have a hard hat, some visi, and some hard steel-toed boots on, you're now placing your crew in violation of some occupational health and safety procedures. So why are they standing around? Maybe one of the fellows there is the OH&S inspector. Maybe one is the foreman. Maybe they're waiting for the cage for the trench to come. Imagine that. They need a cage in order to crawl into there. So, I mean, we perceive things sometimes, and a picture says 1,000 words, but it could be a very wrong perception, okay? You could have the homeowner at the back there watching what's going on, okay? So best practices for good governance. First and foremost, there needs to be clarity in the delineation of duties between council and administration. And again, I'm going to emphasize the need for job descriptions, contracts, policies, procedures, bylaws. Those are your mechanism to create that clarity. A good rule of thumb is NIFO, nose in, fingers out. You as councillors should not be doing the work. You're precluded from being an employee. So follow the rule, nose in, fingers out. Council's not involved in the day-to-day management of the municipality. Council ultimately makes that decision by the resolution and action of council. So a decision of majority council is binding. Other than that, individuals can monitor, but they cannot be directly involved. So council monitors the CAO, determines the level of compensation, deals with the performance issues of the CAO. The CAO is then responsible for ensuring the proper supervision of all the rest of the employees. Any of you have strat plans? Okay, that's a great way of setting the direction for where your municipality wants to go. It sets clear goals and outcomes. Where is council going? How are you going to get there? And ideally, council evaluates the progress of the goals and objectives that you've identified for your administrator. Council approves and reviews the municipal budget, sets the financial plans, material transactions, capital plans, bylaws, and policies. Council ensures ethical behavior amongst themselves and administration and ensures that your administrator is complying with the legislation, auditing and accounting principles, as well as consistently applying and following the governance documents, policies, and bylaws that you have established. And unfortunately, from time to time, you hear of bad situations where that hasn't happened, where you have counselors that are directly involved in awarding contracts to family or friends, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it doesn't bode well for the municipality. It doesn't bode well for the elected officials. So following this practice protects you as a counselor. Council assesses its own efficiencies in fulfilling responsibilities, including any other functions that it's assigned in its governance model. So email, intranet, do you use tablets or iPads? Is there better ways to create efficiencies amongst yourselves so that you can be better informed of what's going on without feeling you got to get off of your chair and get involved in doing or seeing what's going on? Council reserves the right to exercise final judgment on any material decision that impacts the municipality And again, this should be formally defined in the delegation and expectations of your administration. If you have action items from your council meetings, does your resolution include a return date? Or is it left up in the air with an unknown? So again, that's your responsibility as a council to set reasonable and clear expectations. I want a grading policy by this date. What should that grading policy include? How much do we want to spend on grading? Those are the types of things that you as council can establish without having to get into the nitty-gritty of monitoring what the employees are doing. So council must be satisfied with the reports it receives regularly on matters and take the time to read and understand the reports. Many administrators feel, oh yeah, council wants all this information and they don't do anything with it. Ask yourself, is the information you're requesting of value? What's the return on that investment of getting that information? How much time is it taking your administrator, your public works manager to get that information? And what are you going to do with it? So get the right information, get the information that is of value, and make decisions based on that information that you get. And you have the right to retain outside advisors, legal, financial. Council should be coaches. They should provide direction and advice, but they are not to be doing management's job. They provide confidence and assurance to the ratepayers that their dollars are spent appropriately. They monitor management's delegation of authority, so be informed of what's going on, but don't meddle. The administrator should only have to come to council when it is customary or appropriate to do so, i.e. hiring an administrative assistant. If you have money in the budget for an administrative assistant and someone leaves, you as a council are not responsible for hiring that administrative assistant. That responsibility lies with your CAO. They have the responsibility of supervising. They should have the right to determine who they hire and inform council of who they've hired, why, and what basis, okay? That is not council to be deciding who the administrative assistant should be or who the grader operator is. Set the criteria for a grader operator. Must have a clear driving record, must be able to have 50 hours of experience on equipment. Those things can be established without you having to be actually involved in the recruitment of a grader operator. So we've talked about municipal legislation. We're going to briefly touch on the Saskatchewan Employment Act. Managers are exempt from overtime as long as they are managing. In order to be a manager, you have to have the ability to impact the economic livelihood of an employee, meaning scheduling their hours, determine the rates of pay, hire, fire, discipline, all those things. If you as a council are managing the employees, your CAO may be exempt from this provision, meaning that if they're working 50 or 60 hours a week and they are disgruntled, they can go to employment standards and say, listen, I've worked all these hours, I should be entitled to overtime, 1.5 times my rate of pay for all the extra hours I've worked. And here's my documentation of all the hours that I've worked. And my council has not given me any authority to hire, fire, or discipline. So truly, I'm not a manager. I'm simply an administrator. Okay? So just be careful that you are not doing the job of your management and then creating a potentially unfunded liability for your situation. So managers and supervisors typically have a one or more working relationship. They're part of an employee-employee relationship and are directly responsible for the supervision of those employees. As I noted, they hire, evaluate, promote, discipline, fire. So if your council is doing this, think twice about it. Maybe back off. So the manager and supervisor responsibilities are also to ensure a health and safe work environment. So that picture we saw, the trench, and I'm telling you guys, if you walk up, the exposure that you're placing on yourself and the work crew, you must be trained. You must be trained with occupational safety. Your employees must be trained. You can't go out there and direct the workforce, because if you're not trained and you're starting to direct the workforce, you're potentially creating a liability for your municipality and for yourself as an individual. You must also ensure that there's no harassment in the workplace. So, anybody here at Bill C-45? Okay, Bill C-45 was passed by the Canadian government relative to the West Ray incident. And I don't know if you recall that, but down east there was the methane explosion where many, many miners lost their lives. And the issue at hand was the management knew that there was methane gas being released. And although the company paid a big fine, the thought was someone should be held responsible, because money isn't everything. Who's going to be held responsible? So the Bill C-45 established a legal duty for all employees directing the workers to take reasonable steps to ensure the safety of the workers and the public. Now, I don't know if any of you heard about the recent Toronto scaffold collapse. There was a project manager who was overseeing a project, and 5 workers on a scaffold 13 stories high. The project manager had a safety harness on. He asked the supervisor, how come you guys don't have your safety harnesses on? Supervisor says, never mind. And of course, these are immigrant workers, so they're not going to buck too much because they just want a job, right? Well, the scaffold collapsed. It breaks in half. 4 guys fall to their death. 1 is critically injured. The only safe one is the project manager who wore his safety harness. On January 11th, that man was sentenced to serve 3.5 years in jail for negligence causing death. Okay? The law has escalated to the point where safety is a huge priority. In Saskatchewan, we have Mission Zero. Don't start meddling in areas where you don't know what your obligations are, and make sure that your employees and your public works crew are well trained before you're sending them on any equipment. So counselors versus managers. Sometimes there's confusion. I won't go through this slide in detail because I'm seeing that we don't have a tremendous amount of time and I got lots more to cover. So sometimes there's confusion between the authority of council and the authority of the employees. And we've talked at length about this to some extent, but make sure that you're working within your scope of responsibility. We've reviewed the legislation. It clearly defines your role. You have the opportunity to set policies and procedures to protect yourself. And again, I do want to emphasize the mayor is not a supervisor. So don't put that on your mayor. They are a part of a team, and all decisions of council must be made by resolution of council. So as a governing leader, you represent the interests of the community. You speak to the organization in the community's voice. You're elected by the public to represent the public, the greater good of your community. You're not the manager. You're not responsible for the operational day-to-day affairs of the municipality. At the same time, you represent the organized interests. However, how you act impacts the organization. And quite often, employees feel if council says something, I should jump, because after all, it's council. Well, don't put your employees in that situation where they're feeling they have to jump because councillor so-and-so has asked them to do something. Remember, your authority lies as a decision of council as a whole and based on your policies, procedures, and bylaws. So if you're following a bylaw or procedure, fine, but if not, really, you shouldn't be putting that type of onus on your employees. As a councillor, you act to govern and support the organization. You're not an employee or a supervisor. So monitoring versus managing. Some questions you might want to ask yourself as a council when you get home. Are we monitoring or are we managing? And if you're managing, maybe step back. Take a look at what you could do differently, what policies, bylaws, or procedures you could put in place to diminish that level of involvement so that you are truly an elected official providing a governance leadership role rather than stepping in and doing some of those functions that places you and potentially the municipality in a liability situation. So setting clear expectations. Some of you do have performance management plans. That's wonderful. Going to recommend that you communicate more than once a year with your CAO administrator. Have regular discussions with them. Tell them how they're doing. Check in. See what's happening. Council needs to provide ongoing feedback and communication. There needs to be a clear understanding of what the work goals are expected. Do you have a 5-year capital plan? Do you have a strat plan? Have you reviewed your 5-year capital plan and set your priorities? Or are you expecting your administrator to wave in the wind and not have any idea of what your priorities are? So if you set the priorities, then you can provide the administrator the opportunity to succeed, because they will understand what your expectations are, and you can work together to achieve those outcomes. Communication is critical at all levels. Employees love to know what's going on. They care about their community, or they wouldn't be working for the municipality. So make sure that there's communication to all employees. Anybody know the number one reason why an employee leaves an organization? Number one reason is the boss. They don't like their boss. That's the number one reason. They don't like their boss. So if you have huge employee turnover in your public works department or as an administrator, take a look at what the boss is doing. And I'm going to say to you as a council, if you're having difficulty recruiting and retaining your administrator, maybe you need to look at the way you're operating. But that's the number one reason employees leave an organization. 3 reasons why employers can end up paying big dollars when terminating an employee. Number 1 is they haven't set clear expectations. They have their sight here. The employee has no idea what those targets are. The council gets frustrated and wants to get rid of that administrator or whoever. And then they find they haven't done any documentation. They haven't set the clear goals. They haven't done any performance management or progressive discipline. And then they find they don't have an employment contract. So now they're going to pay huge dollars on legal fees and a severance package because they haven't set clear expectations, they haven't documented any performance issues, and there's no employment contract. So 3 things you can all do in your municipalities to protect yourself is do those things. So performance management is a system that provides timely and effective feedback, setting clear goals and expectations. Is this being done? Is there trust, respect, confidence, and collaboration in the process? Are the goals aligned to a strategic plan? Are they clear and realistic, or have you got so much piled on your administrator that it is impossible for them to get through the pile? Okay? Council, again, should be monitoring, not meddling. And quite often, we need to stop and take a look. Is further training required to provide that administrator or manager an opportunity to succeed? What are your expectations? Do they need some HR classes or project management classes? What do they need to succeed to get you where you want to go? And is there sufficient support? So performance evaluations should be done regularly, but they're not to do discipline. So don't have all these issues that you're logging and tracking and then sit down once a year with your employee and say, geez, I didn't like this and this and this and this. Well, that should never happen at an evaluation. That's not creating a trusting, collaborative approach. If you have performance issues, they need to be dealt with immediately, timely, and the employee should know when it comes to the evaluation time what they did wrong. Now, a lot of employers get in trouble when they say performance expectations meets, and then they want to terminate someone. Well, you don't have just cause because you just said they meet expectations. So performance expectations must be clearly identified. If there are areas that need improvement and growth, identify them. Be realistic. If they are exceeding in performance expectations, let them know. Give them that positive feedback. But don't just do a meets, because you're not giving anybody any constructive feedback. You're not setting any clear goals or expectations. And you're creating yourself another liability, because if you decide at some point in time that you want to terminate that employee, you don't have just cause. So when things don't go well, what do? Well, it's called the principle of progressive discipline. It's not to fire someone. First and foremost, it's to have them correct their behaviors. And too often, we let it go on too long, and so that practice becomes ingrained and permitted. So it's critical that you identify the problem and identify how to improve the problem by offering support. Secondly, it's to deter other employees from engaging in the same or similar activity. If someone is always missing deadlines, and they miss deadlines, and they miss deadlines, you can't expect the other employee to meet those deadlines. You're saying deadlines don't matter, right? So hold true to what your expectations are. And thirdly, it's critical for council to ensure their leadership demonstrates that they are committed to do what is necessary to maintain the confidence and respect of other employees. So if you're not prepared to deal with the administrator and there's issues, you will find that your employees are not going to trust and respect you as a council. You are the leaders, you must be role models. Likewise, your administrator must be a leader and a role model. Lastly, when you do progressive discipline, it must outline the consequences. It must say what will happen if you don't follow what we're asking you to do. So typically it's further disciplinary action up to including termination. Sometimes employees cannot change something, sometimes they choose not to change. But you need to do more than talk. You must document what your concerns are, let them know, put it in writing, and follow up. If they do a significant improvement, give them a pat on the back. Say, thanks, wow, that's great that you've done that. So there's many reasons for not meeting the performance standard, for dealing with disciplinary action. And I won't go through them, but there's 101 reasons to perform disciplinary action, from insubordination to attendance issues to unauthorized expenses. One example I recently experienced in a municipality was they had a purchasing policy with an expenditure limit of $5,000. The administrator had a passion for fountain pens and bought himself a $3,000 fountain pen. So, wow, like bizarre. Is that disciplinary? Yes, that's cause for discipline, okay? And I do want to identify the very last one. People have this false idea that you can't discipline for poor attitude. Yes, you can. If someone has poor attitude, you don't have to tolerate it. Document it. What did they say? If you have a ratepayer that comes to you with a complaint, document it. Let it be known. You can tell your employees you expect customer service to be friendly, positive, and provide the information in a timely manner. And failure to do so will result in further disciplinary action. And if they do it again and again, eventually, yes, you can terminate them for a poor attitude. But it must be documented. Okay? There's some more reasons for disciplinary action, and I won't go through them. So then there's the matter of just cause terminations. So just cause terminations are not defined in any legislation, but the courts say that if you have just cause and it's gross misconduct, you can terminate immediately. The guy with the fountain pen, total abuse. If you've done your progressive discipline and you've done the progressive steps, you can terminate for just cause. So the benefit of terminating for just cause is there's no severance. You don't have to pay anybody out. You've done your due diligence, you've told them what's expected, you've told them what they're doing wrong, you need to identify what the expectations are, and if they don't improve, you have the right to terminate without incurring any legal expenses, any severance, and you can do it immediately. Okay? So you must do just cause termination based on evidence. So sometimes it involves an investigation or consulting, but that is the process. And so many municipalities throw their hands up and say, oh, I don't know how to do that, or that's too much work, we'll just pay him out. Well, is that due diligence to the taxpayers' dollars? Not really. So some of the reasons why performance is not addressed, especially if you're in a small community, because you know the person. Council might know them, or they might be family members, or you might socialize with them, and you know what? It's difficult. It's not an easy thing to do. It's hard to do. But then again, what are the disadvantages of performing progressive discipline in a timely manner? The truth is there are none. If someone's doing something wrong, it's way easier to nip it in the bud than let it go on and on and on. And the outcomes, the anticipated outcome of progressive discipline is they're going to change their behavior and comply with what is expected. So progressive discipline offers the employee several opportunities to address the problems and achieve acceptable performance. It sets the performance standards, and it maintains management's right to manage. So I'm going to quickly go through the steps of progressive discipline. First is the coaching or the verbal, okay? And you talk twice, but no more than twice. If you're talking and talking and talking and talking, it's time to stop talking and do some documentation, because you're not getting anywhere. Do you remember what you had for breakfast last week? Not likely. So if you haven't documented it, you don't know how long those performance issues are going on. So for example, someone is late on one day, you document, Joe, you were late on January the 29th. Joe's late February 2nd. So now you're meeting with Joe and you say, Joe, you were late January 29th, you're late again February 2nd. I don't like this, you need to change. Joe's gonna listen. She remembered I was late on January the 29th. Uh-oh. So Joe's late a third time. Now you're gonna progress to the written warning. You're gonna say to Joe, that's not acceptable. And is that fair? All those guys leaning on the shovel, maybe they were there because the operator wasn't there. Maybe the operator slept in or late or was AWOL, who knows? So maybe you got 6 or 7 guys waiting for your one key guy to get there. And I'm sure that's happened on numerous occasions. So do you let that continue? Do you let Joe be late all the time? No, it's critical that it's addressed. So you must provide a written warning and include the information, date, time, place, what was observed by whom, when and where, what was the policy or the job description and fraction. And if you take anything away from this session, it's when you do progressive discipline, always, always, always include this last statement on the letter. Failure to comply shall result in further disciplinary action up to and including termination. Okay? They need to know the consequences. If you don't put that on, you will not establish just cause. So steps 3 and steps 4 are suspensions. So you know that rule, 3 strikes and you're out? Okay, verbal, written, suspension. And suspensions can vary in length from 1 to 3 days, sometimes up to 5. If a person is late, it might be a 1 day. But if it's harassment or say they got in a fight with somebody, it might be more significant, 3 or 5 day suspension. And finally, if they still are doing the same things, you terminate. And you've got now just cause, because you've established it, you've documented, and you no longer have to worry about a lawsuit or paying somebody out. You've established, you've done your due diligence, and you're clear to terminate. So sometimes we get stuck in a situation where we don't know whether we should be terminating at step 1 or step 4. So gross misconduct or just cause can be for where there's gross negligence. And sometimes that happens for a number of reasons: job impairment, drugs and alcohol, falsifying documents, someone being off a week sick and you find out they were on a holiday in Jamaica but they submit a doctor's note, but then you check with the doctor and voila, the doctor never issued that note, okay? Things like that could be considered just cause for immediate termination. Again, the fine should fit the crime, so to speak. So you don't have to start at the verbal, written. You can start at a written if it was something of significance, okay? So when you're providing discipline and feedback, focus on the results, not the person. What was the consequence of the action or inaction? So it's not the few minutes late, it's the fact that you've got 6 guys waiting around and equipment not running because that person was late. People want to work with someone who's got the guts and determination to deal with the problems. Deal with performance issues in private, have proper representation, be specific, don't fluff it up with the conversation about the hockey game or anything else. Watch your language, focus on removing the roadblocks, and be careful not to shoot the messenger. Hold people accountable. So I'm going to tell you a story about a SaskTel arbitration. There were 2 fellows doing service calls in a rural area. One of their colleagues had passed away, and they stopped at the parents' house to express their condolences, had a shot or 2 of rum, and then as they're leaving, each were given a beer as they're driving back to return the vehicle. Well, lo and behold, hit black ice, roll the vehicle, and of course the police show up, empty beer bottles. The employees are terminated. They had a policy, no drinking and driving, okay? Goes through arbitration, 22 months later, the employees get reinstated. In part, they got reinstated because senior management could drink and drive. It was a permitted practice. Even though the policy said you couldn't do it, they were letting the CEOs and the managers do it. They would attend a conference like this, have a social, and drink and drive. So those 2 employees were reinstated. So make sure you're accountable. Develop your policies and procedures, stick to your guns, make sure that everybody is expected to have the same threshold. Okay? Results of doing nothing, you get a toxic work environment. Poor behavior is condoned. You've lowered the watermark. You've brought down the productivity of your municipality. Now your bare bones budget is totally wasted because you got people whispering, bickering, not cooperating. You've just killed your budget through a whole bunch of wasted time and effort. Guys are abusing equipment. They're arguing over things. High performers leave. They don't want to belong to an organization like that. People phone in sick. It's a terrible work environment. Why do I want to come to work? Anyway, so the results of doing nothing are not good. You're way better off taking a proactive step in dealing with those difficult issues, especially in your small communities, because once seen, it's seen everywhere. So do it in a timely manner and take charge and control. We're going to quickly talk about the duty to accommodate. So this is legislation that's come into place, and it's another area or potential liability. If you notice an employee with some problems, find out what the problems are. If they're suffering from a dependency issue, family issue, if they have a physical ailment, you need to stop and find out what it is and look at a possible accommodation. If your workplace is small, the threshold will be lower in terms of what's considered undue hardship. But you may have to look at providing an employee with an opportunity to modify their duties, work less hours, change jobs. When you do that, you pay them based on the work that they are performing. So if you have an employee who has a dependency problem, you terminate him. Dependency is considered a disability, okay? You could be in trouble with a big lawsuit. For example, same thing with someone who develops MS. I mean, lots of people in Saskatchewan get MS. You don't have the right to know what their disability is, but I'm sure you can see in their behaviors and their actions that they have a challenge. So you have a responsibility as an employer to accommodate that disability or illness. You can find out what they can lift, push, pull, how much they can carry, but you can't terminate them because they've got MS. At some point you may, but you still have to take a look at what are the concerns or issues. So the accommodation process is to recognize the need for accommodation, gather the information, find out what the limitations are, what you can accommodate them in, make an informed decision based on the evidence that you've got, and then implement that decision. So if you do have a situation where you do have a potential accommodation, investigate it. Don't just fire the gun, so to speak, and terminate. Each accommodation is it's a case-by-case basis. There's no set formula for an accommodation, but it is a legal obligation and requirement of you as a council, as an employer, to make sure that the employees are accommodated. The last thing I'm going to talk about is employment contracts. And every single employee as a minimum should have a letter of offer. Now, the law requires that work schedules be posted 7 days prior to the commencement of the work schedule. And in my experience, there's very, very few employers that actually post a work schedule. So if you put it in their letter of offer saying you're hired as this, working Monday to Friday, or this, specify the hours, the rates of pay, do they have to have a driver's license? Is that a requirement? If so, it should be included in their letter of offer. Is there a need for confidentiality? Things like that should be in a letter of offer. So even the frontline employees, what's their layoff date? There should be letters that clearly state what the terms and conditions of employment are. Now, when you offer work to employees, you have to make sure that you're meeting the threshold of the Saskatchewan Employment Act. You cannot offer something less than, like hour-for-hour bank time. You can't do that. So things to consider in a contract of employment: is it a conditional offer, meaning it's subject to verification of your credentials, criminal record check, reference checks, your driver's abstract? So there's conditional offers, and then there's a formal offer. Do they have to maintain a clear criminal record check? If they're working with children, you may want to ensure that they have a vulnerable sector check as well. What's the nature of a contract? Is it for new employment? Is it promotion? Is it a temporary where they'll revert to a different position? Is it based on funding or a special project that you've established? Is it full-time or part-time? It should all be identified in their contracts. Is it for a limited period or indefinite? Many councils have established contracts with their CAOs for a fixed term. Could be 2 or 3 years. After that term, they can renew or extend the agreement. It's not an indefinite contract. So now you're saying, I'm going to put you on a fixed term contract rather than an indefinite contract. So after 2 years or 3 years, if things aren't going well, you don't have to extend or renew that contract. Always have a probation clause. If it's a frontline employee, 3 months is probably reasonable. If it's a CAO administrator, 12 months. You want to see them in their performance the full cycle. And then what's the job description? Typically, it should be attached to the contract so that you're clearly spelling out what that job description entails, and that you have the right to reassign or modify the work. That prevents you from getting into a constructive dismissal claim. What is the salary? Is it annual or hourly? What are their management responsibilities? What's the compensation and benefits? How do they progress for a salary increase? Is it based on the performance evaluation that they must meet the expectations, otherwise they get a 0? That's the way it should be, but most don't specify that, and they just keep rolling along with those increases. What are the benefits? You've got a great pension plan. The Municipal Employees Pension Plan is an absolutely fabulous pension plan, and that should be a huge selling factor to any employee you're trying to recruit. Are the plans mandatory? In most cases, they are. What do you have for professional development? Are you encouraging them to obtain some certification? For example, I don't know if you recall, the University of Regina had a professor teaching that had no degree whatsoever. So you have the right to obtain that information, to request that they maintain that standard, and then determine who pays for it. Do they need to be a member of a certain organization? Confidentiality clause, I cannot emphasize enough the need for that. You have much confidential information in your municipalities. Your CAO has access to personnel information. There should definitely be a clause in every employee's contract regarding confidentiality. Lots of employers have set social media policies in place, and I'm sure you've heard the blur that how you act outside of the work can impact your ability to retain employment. There's been many cases where employees have been terminated due to their activity outside. And have those termination clauses. Quite often you can request your CAO or administrator to provide you 2 or 3 months notice before they resign. If they sign their name to that contract, chances are you are going to get that 2 to 3 months notice. That will give you time to plan and to do a replacement. If you don't, there's nothing saying they have to give you any notice other than the legislation, which is 2 weeks. Well, in 2 weeks, it's impossible to recruit an administrator. Same thing with the termination. Is it employment standards or is there a formula? For every year of service, I'll give you 1 month of severance to a maximum of 12 months. Or is it clear-cut 3-year contract, 3 months of severance? That mitigates your liability relative to, lawsuits, etc. So employment contracts are absolutely critical. It talks about your authorization for leave. Who do you get to go? Do you get to come and go as you want, or what's the process and procedure? Is there a conflict of interest? Can they hire their wife or spouse to be a grader operator or the secretary? So all those things should be identified, and they should have an opportunity to obtain independent legal advice. So I know I've talked a lot about the hard things to do. On a positive note, make sure you recognize your employees. Unlike that first picture, most municipal employees are really hardworking, dedicated people. Give them a pat on the back, recognize them when they do a good job, have a little bit of a recognition program, do some team building events, win their hearts and minds, and you'll find that they are far more productive, far happier, and you won't have to be worrying about doing any performance management, discipline, etc. So council's role as an employer, tools that enhance the understanding, resolve the blurred roles, have a clear organizational structure, clearly delineate what your job is and what their job is, have employment contracts, job descriptions, do performance management, including the difficult job of progressive discipline. You need to do more than talk. Establish policies, and like I said, there's all kinds of municipalities out there that have a whole book of policies. Plagiarize, don't need to reinvent the wheel. Take a look at what they have and make it fit to work your organization, but set the parameters that you're comfortable with as a council. Establish codes of conduct. How are you as a role model? How do you expect your employees to be? Strategic plans, I know there's opportunities there. We all could benefit through that. And regular performance measurement tied to a strategic plan. Celebrate your achievements, celebrate your goals. And if you do this, you'll have a respectful, productive workplace. Anyway, I'll turn it over to the floor for any questions anybody has.
Hello, Steve with Town of Springside. First question would be, you said that no member of council can be on a committee or anything like that. How does that affect if you're on the volunteer fire department?
I guess there's different insurance for that. So as a councillor, you are not an employee, because if you're a volunteer fire department, it's not a paid, you're not receiving a remuneration or salary, right?
Well, we do. We receive $10 or $15 an hour.
Okay. I believe in that case there is an exemption specifically for volunteer firefighters. Now, I would check with advisory services to make 100% sure, but I know municipalities buy special insurance for their volunteer fire departments, and it's recognized as a unique situation because of the fact that it's their equipment and they need people to volunteer.
Okay. Second question was, is my understanding clear on that our administrator, if she delegates duties to the town employees, she is then bound by Bill C-45?
Yes. So she cannot tell employees what to do if it is unsafe. And remember, employees should be trained and they have the right to refuse to do the work if they know it's unsafe. And so they should refuse to do the work, and they have that right to refuse.
Okay. And I guess the third one would be, now knowing that we're doing everything improperly, obviously, but if our administrator is supposed to be the one that is to, I guess, dole out the bad news to any of the employees, if they don't feel comfortable doing it by themselves, is it wrong to have a member of council there to be with them for representation?
it's not wrong, and there's other options, Steve. I mean, if you're the Public Works Supervisor Manager, maybe that person could sit in as well. So, you know, sometimes you may choose an elected official to be a representative, but also remember that when you're doling out bad news, if it's documented, you have your evidence, right? Mm-hmm. You don't want an employee to feel everybody's ganging up on them.
Right, but also you generally want to have two people there when you're reprimanding somebody just for
Well, and especially if it's in a unionized environment.
Right.
You know.
No, I was just curious as to if seeing that council should not be involved with the management of the employees if it was wrong to have one of them to be there at the same time.
Observer. They're not the one determining it. So it shouldn't be the mayor or the councillor that says this is what you're doing wrong. It should be the administrator that's saying, here's the performance concern, date, time, place, here's what you need to do differently, and you need to modify your behavior, or here's the consequences.
Perfect. Nope. It's very, very informative. Thanks.
I'm from the town of Clonsey. I'm a councillor. This is, for some places, there might be a transition here. And I think the transition is not a quick one based on the environment and the employees and the councillors that are actually dealing with each other, like for years and years. So is there, that would be the way to go, is to do a transition over a period of time, because people will start shooting each other if they do this within 10 hours or even 6 months.
Right, precisely. Yeah. So establish your priorities. And quite often what I find in the municipality, the priority is the procurement policy, the purchasing policy. So that's a good place to start, because again, it sets that structure for what the budget monetary provisions are, keeping in line with the budget, but giving some authority to the administrator. And then you might want to do some personnel policies as to what is an employment contract, what are the provisions there. So baby steps, without a doubt. You'll never do a full sweep, but it's important to recognize that by doing nothing, you are potentially creating a liability for yourself. And again, in every situation, a bad apple can rot the whole bucket, right? And it's tough to find good employees, and you want to retain them. So it's really important that you are dealing with some of those performance issues that if you know that they're out there.
So all of this reference that's been on the overhead, that is in the legislation, because you're referring to a lot of the sections of the acts and stuff? Yeah,
it is. And so as I understand, my presentation will be posted on the website. So, I mean, those references of the legislation, pull them out, look at them.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
I'm Jim from the Village of Pierceland. I'm the mayor. I would like to know how many villages in here. You got to remember, we're all under 500 people. We likely have one administrator and one employee. That doesn't work, I'm sorry.
Alec, I'm a councillor with the Village of Frontier. In our town, we, two councillors, myself and another guy, we do the water testing every day, and at the end of the year, we take it as a remuneration. So is that a conflict of interest? I mean, we're a small town, we're trying to save money.
I hear you, and you're obviously...
We help with water breaks and everything else, you know. We can't be the only village or town that does that.
But the legislation says that you cannot be an employee. So, I mean, there is an exception for the volunteer fire. Again, I'd suggest you consult with Municipal Advisory Services and talk to them about whether you need a committee or a procedure. Did you have it established as a policy that there will be this provided? You know, that's something to look at, because as a council, the legislation clearly says you are not to be an employee. An employee seeking election as a councillor must resign from their position or take a temporary leave in order to be elected.
Yeah, we do it because nobody else wants to do it. Nobody else will do it. Yeah.
So maybe you look at it as a contracted service versus an employee.
It's kind of a volunteer position, basically. I mean, we get paid a pittance for doing it. So.
Well, again, be careful on the conflict of interest. Possibly look at it as a employment contract per se, not as an employee. So it's a fee for service versus an employee-employer relationship. Might be the best way to go, but again, Municipal Advisory Services would be able to help you on that.
Bonnie Gigon from the town of Duck Lake. We've just gone through the process of having our administrator retire last year, and we've actually gone through 2 administrators since then. And somebody who was taking the classes and then decided they didn't want to do it, and now a new administrator. And I understand and I value our employees. We are sort of at a crossroads where things were done differently a number of years ago. Council was more hands-on, nose in, whatever. And now we want our CAO to take that responsibility, but I guess I'm just unclear, what can we ask of our CAO to come back and let us know? Is that appropriate to say, okay, in your administrator's report, we'd like to know, where things are at as far as the overtime, the bank time, the whatever. It's just because we need to make decisions on that, or is that just for her to do?
No, you are to be informed. So you have the right to know, and they have the responsibility to ensure that they're managing within that directive of council.
Okay. So then it's for us to be clear on our policies and what our needs are, and she does that and then comes back to us with that.
So, you could even establish a policy on overtime, when it's to be worked, what's the process, how it's approved, rather than just an open ticket.
I'm on first name basis with the guys at Standards and Employment Standards because we have just redone a whole policy on overtime. Yeah. And, our men are very happy. It's fair, so.
Yeah, but it provides that clarity, and that's the clarity that you need.
Thanks, Laurie.
Thank you all. Have a great rest of conference.